I thought I was tough until I spent 3 days trying to recreate a single meal that a 9-year-old Viking child would have eaten without complaint. My hands were bleeding from attempting to butcher meat with primitive tools. My stomach was cramping from the rancid fish oil that Vikings considered a delicacy, and I hadn't even gotten to the part where I'd need to sleep outside in freezing temperatures while wearing nothing but scratchy wool. That's when it hit me. Everything I thought I knew about Vikings was wrong, and everything I thought I knew about myself was even more wrong. You see, we've been fed this romanticized image of Viking warriors as bearded badasses who sailed around, looking cool and pillaging villages for fun. But the reality is that if you or I were somehow transported back to 9th century Scandinavia, we wouldn't last 3 days, let alone become feared warriors. The Vikings weren't just tough, they were a completely different species of human being, forged by a world so harsh that it would break our minds before it broke our bodies. And after months of research into what their daily lives actually looked like, I can tell you with absolute certainty that you would be the worst Viking warrior in history. But understanding why reveals something far more disturbing about how soft we've actually become. When I first started researching authentic Viking life, I expected to find stories of epic battles and heroic raids that would make me feel inspired and masculine. Instead, I found myself staring at archaeological evidence that painted a picture of existence so brutal, so physically demanding, and so psychologically challenging that it made modern military training look like a spa vacation. These weren't people who chose to be warriors because it seemed exciting. They were people who became warriors because their environment literally gave them no other choice. Every single day of a Viking's life was a fight for survival that began before dawn and didn't end until they collapsed from exhaustion. They lived in a world where the weak died quickly, where comfort was not just rare but actively dangerous, and where the soft psychological cushions that protect our modern minds simply didn't exist. A Viking child learned to endure pain, cold, hunger, and fear not because these things built character, but because failing to endure them meant death. They developed physical capabilities that would seem superhuman to us, psychological resilience that would baffle our therapists, and a relationship with violence and death that would horrify our sensibilities. And all of this happened not through choice, but through necessity, because in their world, being weak wasn't just disadvantageous, it was literally fatal. But what I discovered about the specific ways we would fail as Vikings goes far deeper than just physical weakness. The first thing that would destroy you as a Viking warrior isn't what you think. It's not the combat or the sailing or even the harsh weather. It's the simple act of eating their food. I spent weeks trying to recreate authentic Viking meals, and the experience was genuinely traumatic. Vikings ate fermented fish that had been buried in the ground for months, drinking the oil that seeped out as a nutritional supplement. They consumed blood sausages made from actual animal blood mixed with fat and grain, and they considered rotten shark meat aged in its own urine to be a delicacy. But here's what makes this more than just an extreme diet challenge. These foods weren't choices, they were survival necessities in a world where calories were scarce and food preservation meant the difference between life and death. Your modern digestive system, pampered by processed foods and clean water, would rebel violently against this diet. You'd spend your first week as a Viking warrior doubled over with stomach cramps, diarrhea, and nausea while your potential enemies sailed away laughing. And that's assuming you could even force yourself to eat the food in the first place. Which brings us to an even more fundamental problem. The physical conditioning required to be a Viking warrior would be impossible for any modern person to achieve. Not because we lack the potential, but because we lack the decades of gradual adaptation that began in childhood. A Viking warrior could row a longship for 16 hours straight in rough seas while wearing heavy wool clothing and armor. They could march 20 miles through snow while carrying a full pack of weapons and supplies. They could fight hand-to-hand combat for hours without rest, swing a heavy sword or axe thousands of times without losing effectiveness, and do all of this while operating on minimal sleep and irregular meals. But these weren't superhuman abilities, they were the natural result of a lifetime spent in conditions that would hospitalize a modern person within days. A Viking child started developing this conditioning from the moment they could walk, spending their entire childhood performing physical labor that would violate every modern child protection law. They hauled water, chopped wood, herded animals, and helped with farming using tools that were heavy, crude, and dangerous. By the time they reached adolescence, they had already developed bone density, muscle fiber composition, and cardiovascular capacity that would take a modern athlete years of specialized training to achieve. And they did all of this while fighting off diseases, parasites, and nutritional deficiencies that would leave us bedridden. The psychological conditioning required to be a Viking warrior represents an even greater challenge than the physical demands, because it required a fundamental rewiring of how the human mind processes fear, pain, and death. Vikings didn't just accept violence as a part of life. They were raised from birth to see it as natural, necessary, and even desirable. A Viking child witnessed their first human death before they learned to read, participated in their first animal slaughter before they hit puberty, and experienced their first real combat, while most modern children are still playing video games. They developed a relationship with pain that would seem pathological to modern psychologists. They learned to ignore injuries that would send us to the emergency room, to function effectively while experiencing levels of discomfort that would incapacitate us, and to make life or death decisions under stress that would trigger panic attacks in most contemporary people. This wasn't stoicism or toughness in the way we understand those concepts. It was a complete absence of the psychological safety nets that modern humans depend on for basic functioning. Vikings didn't have therapy, didn't have pain medication, didn't have the luxury of avoiding traumatic experiences, and didn't have social systems designed to protect them from psychological damage. They lived in a world where mental weakness was literally fatal, and they adapted accordingly. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of Viking warrior culture for a modern person would be the social expectations around masculinity, honor, and violence that governed every aspect of their behavior. Being a Viking warrior wasn't just a job. It was a complete identity that determined your worth as a human being and your place in society. If you couldn't prove your courage in battle, you were worse than useless. You were actively dangerous to your community because your cowardice could get everyone killed. If you couldn't endure pain without complaint, you were seen as fundamentally defective, unworthy of respect or protection. If you couldn't make quick, violent decisions when necessary, you were a liability that your own people might eliminate to protect themselves. These weren't harsh cultural standards. They were survival requirements in a world where group cohesion and individual reliability meant the difference between life and death for entire communities. A Viking warrior was expected to be ready to die at any moment, not just in the abstract sense of accepting mortality, but in the very practical sense of being able to charge into lethal combat without hesitation whenever the situation demanded it. They had to be willing to watch their friends die, to kill enemies in close combat, and to make decisions that would haunt modern people for the rest of their lives. And they had to do all of this while maintaining the emotional stability and social connections necessary to function as part of a tight-knit community. The technical skills required to be an effective Viking warrior would take a modern person decades to master. Assuming they could master them at all given our fundamentally different relationship with tools, weapons, and physical craftsmanship. I spent months trying to learn basic Viking weapon techniques, and the experience was humbling in ways I didn't expect. A Viking warrior needed to be proficient with at least 6 different types of weapons: sword, axe, spear, seeks, long knife, bow, and shield. But proficiency didn't mean knowing how to swing them around. It meant being able to use each weapon effectively in real combat, while switching between them seamlessly as the tactical situation changed. They needed to understand the strengths and weaknesses of each weapon against different types of armor and shields. They needed to know how to maintain and repair their weapons using primitive tools and limited materials. They needed to be able to improvise weapons from available materials when their primary weapons were lost or broken. And they needed to do all of this while moving in formation with other warriors, following complex tactical commands, and adapting to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. Modern people struggle to maintain focus on a single task for more than a few minutes. But Viking warriors needed to master multiple complex skill sets simultaneously while operating under life-threatening stress. The seamanship skills required 4 Viking raids would be completely beyond the capabilities of any modern person, not just because of the physical demands, but because of the intuitive understanding of weather, water, and navigation that took decades to develop. A Viking warrior needed to be able to read wave patterns to predict storms hours before they arrived. They needed to understand how different wind conditions would affect their ship's handling and adjust their sailing accordingly. They needed to navigate using the sun, stars, and subtle environmental cues in conditions where modern GPS would be useless. They needed to know how to beach a longship on different types of coastlines, how to repair battle damage using materials they could find or steal, and how to coordinate complex maneuvers with other ships during raids and battles. But perhaps most challenging of all, they needed to be able to row for hours at a time in precise coordination with dozens of other men, maintaining rhythm and power even when exhausted, injured, or under attack. The physical coordination required for effective rowing is extraordinarily difficult to master, and the mental discipline required to maintain that coordination under combat stress would break most modern people within minutes. Vikings spent their entire lives developing these skills because their survival depended on them, and there were no shortcuts or technological aids to make the process easier. The survival skills that Viking warriors took for granted would be impossible for most modern people to learn quickly enough to stay alive in their world. They needed to be able to find or create shelter in hostile environments using only materials they could gather or carry. They needed to know how to make fire in wet, windy conditions without matches or lighters. They needed to understand which plants were edible and which were poisonous, how to track and hunt wild animals, and how to preserve meat and other foods without refrigeration. They needed to know basic medical treatments for wounds, infections, and common illnesses, all while operating without any of the pharmaceutical aids that modern people depend on for basic health maintenance. They needed to be able to read terrain and weather patterns to avoid getting lost or caught in dangerous conditions. And they needed to develop the mental fortitude to make life or death decisions quickly and accurately, even when operating on minimal sleep, poor nutrition, and high stress. These weren't specialized skills that only some Vikings possessed. They were basic competencies that every warrior needed to master because their communities couldn't afford to support anyone who couldn't contribute to their collective survival. The learning curve for these skills is measured in years or decades, not weeks or months, and the margin for error was literally zero. But the most challenging skills for a modern person to master would be the social and political competencies that determined a Viking warrior's effectiveness within their community. Being a successful Viking warrior required understanding complex hierarchies, alliances, and obligations that governed every aspect of social interaction. You needed to know exactly how to behave toward people of different social ranks, how to navigate the intricate web of family loyalties and clan obligations, and how to participate in the gift-giving and favor-trading systems that maintain social cohesion. You needed to understand the subtle verbal and nonverbal cues that indicated threat, opportunity, or status changes within your group. You needed to know how to build and maintain the personal relationships that would determine whether others would support you in combat, help you when you were injured, or include you in profitable raids. And you needed to develop the emotional intelligence to manage your own feelings and reactions in ways that wouldn't damage these crucial relationships, even under the extreme stress of combat and survival situations. Modern people struggle with office politics and social media drama, but Viking warriors needed to master political complexity that had life or death consequences while operating in conditions that would overwhelm most contemporary minds. The social skills required weren't just about being likable or charismatic. They were about understanding and navigating systems of power, loyalty, and mutual obligation that were far more complex and consequential than anything most modern people encounter. The psychological demands of Viking warfare would destroy most modern minds before the first battle even began, because it required a complete transformation of how you think about violence, death, and your own mortality. I've studied accounts of Viking raids, and what strikes me most isn't the physical brutality, it's the mental state required to participate in that brutality effectively. A Viking warrior needed to be able to kill strangers in close combat, often people who were running away or begging for mercy. They needed to be able to watch their friends die violently and continue fighting effectively without being paralyzed by grief or trauma. They needed to make split-second decisions about who lived and who died based on tactical considerations rather than moral ones. And they needed to do all of this while maintaining enough emotional control to function as part of a coordinated military unit. Modern people who have never experienced real violence often fantasize about how they would handle combat situations. But the reality is that most contemporary minds would shut down completely when faced with the immediate, visceral reality of trying to kill another human being with a sword or axe. The psychological preparation required to overcome these natural inhibitions took years of gradual conditioning that began in childhood and continued throughout a warrior's entire life. The mental resilience required to survive as a Viking warrior extended far beyond combat situations to include the psychological challenges of their daily existence. Vikings lived with constant uncertainty about food, shelter, and safety that would drive most modern people to nervous breakdowns within weeks. They never knew when their next meal would come, whether their homes would be attacked while they slept, or if they would live to see their families again after embarking on a raid. They operated in a world where planning beyond the immediate future was often pointless because circumstances could change dramatically without warning. They needed to be able to function effectively while carrying the psychological weight of having lost friends and family members to violence, disease, and accidents that were routine parts of their existence. And they needed to maintain social relationships and community bonds despite living in conditions that would strain modern marriages and friendships to the breaking point. The mental toughness required wasn't just about being able to endure hardship. It was about being able to find meaning, purpose, and even joy in a life that was objectively brutal and uncertain. Vikings developed psychological coping mechanisms that allowed them to function in conditions that would break most contemporary minds. But these mechanisms required a fundamental acceptance of violence and death that most modern people are psychologically incapable of achieving. The cognitive demands of Viking warfare required types of mental processing that modern brains simply aren't trained to handle. In combat, a Viking warrior needed to track multiple opponents simultaneously while coordinating with allies, all while processing rapidly changing tactical information and making life-or-death decisions in fractions of seconds. They needed to maintain spatial awareness in chaotic, three-dimensional combat environments where threats could come from any direction without warning. They needed to calculate risk and opportunity instantaneously while operating under extreme physical and emotional stress. And they needed to do all of this while their brain was flooded with adrenaline and other stress hormones that would impair the cognitive functions that modern people depend on for complex decision-making. Modern brains are optimized for processing abstract information in controlled environments, but Viking warriors needed cognitive abilities that were more like those of predatory animals, the ability to process immediate physical threats and opportunities with lightning speed and perfect accuracy. These cognitive skills can't be learned through reading or classroom instruction. They require thousands of hours of practice in actual high-stress situations where mistakes have immediate, severe consequences. Most modern people never develop these types of cognitive abilities because we live in environments where they're not necessary for survival. But perhaps the most challenging mental aspect of Viking warrior culture would be the complete absence of the psychological safety nets that modern people depend on for basic emotional stability. Vikings didn't have the luxury of avoiding traumatic experiences, seeking therapy for psychological damage, or taking time off to recover from stress and overwork. They lived in a world where showing weakness or vulnerability could be fatal, not just for themselves, but for their entire community. They needed to be able to process grief, trauma, and fear without allowing these emotions to interfere with their effectiveness as warriors and community members. They needed to develop internal mental resources that could sustain them through experiences that would hospitalize modern people with PTSD. And they needed to do all of this without any of the pharmaceutical, therapeutic, or social support systems that contemporary people rely on for mental health. The psychological independence required to function as a Viking warrior would be impossible for most modern minds to achieve because we've become fundamentally dependent on external supports and interventions that simply didn't exist in their world. Vikings developed mental toughness not because they were naturally stronger than modern people, but because their survival depended on it, and they had no alternative coping mechanisms available. The social dynamics of Viking society would be psychologically devastating for any modern person because they operated on principles of hierarchy, honor, and collective responsibility that are completely alien to contemporary individualistic thinking. I spent months studying Viking social structures, and what I found was a system so rigidly stratified and collectively oriented that it would feel like psychological imprisonment to anyone raised with modern values. In Viking society, your worth as a human being was determined entirely by your ability to contribute to your group's survival and success. If you couldn't fight, work, or provide value to your community, you weren't just useless, you were actively harmful because you consumed resources without contributing anything in return. There was no concept of individual rights, personal fulfillment, or self-expression as we understand these ideas. Your identity, your choices, and your future were all determined by your position in a complex web of family obligations, clan loyalties, and social hierarchies that left no room for the kind of personal autonomy that modern people consider essential for psychological health. Vikings who couldn't or wouldn't fulfill their social obligations faced not just disapproval or social ostracism, but literal exile or death. The social pressure to conform and perform was so intense that it would crush most contemporary minds. Before they could even begin to adapt, the honor-based culture that governed Viking society would be impossible for most modern people to navigate successfully because it required a completely different understanding of masculinity, reputation, and social value. In Viking culture, honor wasn't an abstract concept. It was a practical resource that determined your access to everything from food and shelter to protection and marriage opportunities. Losing honor was worse than losing your life because it meant losing your place in society and your ability to function as a human being. Vikings were expected to risk their lives to defend their honor, to seek violent revenge for perceived slights, and to prioritize their reputation over their personal safety or comfort. They lived in a world where backing down from a fight, showing fear in dangerous situations, or failing to support your allies could permanently destroy your social standing and make you an outcast from your own community. Modern people struggle with workplace conflicts and social media criticism, but Viking warriors needed to navigate honor-based social dynamics, where making the wrong choice could result in immediate physical violence or lifelong social exile. The psychological pressure of living in a society where your every action was constantly being evaluated and judged according to standards you couldn't afford to fail would break most contemporary minds within days. The collective responsibility that defined Viking communities would be psychologically unbearable for people raised with modern individualistic values. In Viking society, you weren't just responsible for your own actions. You were responsible for the actions of your family members, clanmates, and fighting companions. If your brother committed a crime, you could be held accountable for his behavior. If your fighting companion showed cowardice in battle, it reflected on your judgment and honor. If your family failed to meet their obligations to the community, you could all face collective punishment. Vikings lived in a world where individual privacy, personal autonomy, and private decision-making simply didn't exist. Your choices affected everyone around you, and everyone around you had the right and obligation to intervene in your personal affairs if they thought you were making decisions that could harm the group. Modern people who struggle with family expectations and social obligations would be completely overwhelmed by the level of collective oversight and mutual responsibility that was considered normal in Viking society. The psychological burden of being constantly accountable to your community for every aspect of your behavior would be impossible for most contemporary minds to bear, but the most psychologically destructive aspect of Viking social dynamics would be the complete absence of the emotional support and validation that modern people depend on for basic psychological stability. Vikings didn't have the luxury of expecting sympathy, understanding, or emotional support when they were struggling with personal problems. They lived in a world where showing vulnerability was dangerous, where seeking help was seen as weakness, and where personal problems were expected to be solved through individual effort and determination. There were no therapists, support groups, or social services to help Vikings cope with trauma, loss, or mental health issues. They were expected to process grief, fear, and pain internally without burdening their community with their emotional needs. The social environment was so harsh and demanding that it would strip away all of the psychological coping mechanisms that modern people use to maintain their emotional equilibrium. Vikings who couldn't adapt to these social expectations didn't gradually improve with support and understanding. They were eliminated from the community through violence, exile, or social death. The social Darwinism that governed Viking communities was so intense that it would destroy most modern people before they could even begin to understand the rules they were expected to follow. But here's what I discovered that completely changed my understanding of why we would fail as Viking warriors. It's not that we're physically weaker or less intelligent than Vikings were. In many ways, we're actually superior to them in terms of raw capabilities. Modern humans are taller, stronger, faster, and smarter than our ancestors. We have better nutrition, better medical care, and access to training methods that could theoretically produce physical abilities that would amaze Vikings. We have educational systems that develop cognitive abilities far beyond what any Viking could achieve. We have access to information and technology that would seem magical to them. But we've also developed a fundamental psychological dependency that would make us completely unable to function in their world, and it's not what you think it is. It's not that we're softer or more pampered, though we are. It's not that we're less violent or aggressive, though we are. The real problem is that we've become psychologically dependent on systems of support, validation, and external structure that create an illusion of strength while actually making us weaker than we realize. The hidden weakness that would destroy us as Viking warriors is our complete dependence on external validation and constant feedback to maintain our sense of self-worth and direction. Modern people are raised in systems where our value is constantly being measured, evaluated, and reinforced by others. We depend on grades, job performance reviews, social media likes, and endless forms of external feedback to know whether we're doing well or poorly. We've become psychologically addicted to constant reassurance and guidance from authority figures, experts, and social systems that tell us what to think, how to behave, and what goals to pursue. Vikings had none of these systems. They lived in a world where you had to develop internal standards of value and self-worth that could sustain you through periods of isolation, failure, and uncertainty without any external validation or support. They had to be able to make decisions and take actions based on their own judgment and courage without needing approval or permission from others. The psychological independence required to function as a Viking warrior would be impossible for most modern people to achieve because we've never developed the internal resources necessary to sustain ourselves without constant external input and validation. The second hidden weakness that would destroy us is our complete inability to function without technological and institutional support systems that we don't even realize we depend on. Modern people live in a world where almost every aspect of our survival is managed by complex systems that we don't understand and can't control. We depend on electrical grids for power, water treatment plants for clean water, supply chains for food, medical systems for healthcare, legal systems for protection, and financial institutions for economic security. But more fundamentally, we depend on these systems not just for physical survival, but for psychological stability. We've become mentally dependent on the predictability and reliability of modern life in ways that would make us completely unable to cope with the uncertainty and self-reliance that defined Viking existence. Vikings had to be able to create their own shelter, find their own food, treat their own injuries, and protect themselves without any external support. They had to be able to function effectively when everything they depended on could disappear without warning. The psychological resilience required to maintain effectiveness under those conditions would be impossible for minds that have been trained to expect and depend on external support systems for basic functioning. But the most devastating hidden weakness that would destroy us as Viking warriors is our complete inability to form and maintain the types of deep, unconditional social bonds that were essential for survival in their world. Modern people live in a social environment that emphasizes individual achievement, personal choice, and emotional autonomy in ways that actually prevent us from developing the kinds of relationships that Vikings depended on for survival. We're trained to see relationships as optional, conditional, and based on mutual benefit rather than unconditional loyalty and obligation. We expect to be able to leave relationships that don't meet our needs, to prioritize our own interests over group interests, and to maintain emotional independence from others. But Vikings lived in a world where survival depended on absolute loyalty to your fighting companions, unconditional support for your family and clan, and the willingness to risk your life for people you might not even particularly like. The social bonds that held Viking communities together were forged through shared hardship, mutual dependence, and the constant threat of death that made everyone valuable to everyone else. Modern people who have been raised to value independence and self-sufficiency would be psychologically incapable of forming the kinds of intense, dependent relationships that were necessary for survival in Viking society. We would be isolated and vulnerable in a world where isolation meant death. The brutal truth about why you would be a terrible Viking warrior isn't that you're weak. It's that you're weak in all the wrong ways and strong in all the wrong ways. You have physical capabilities that would amaze Vikings, but you lack the psychological resilience to use those capabilities effectively under pressure. You have access to information and knowledge that would seem godlike to them, but you lack the practical skills and instinctive understanding necessary to survive without technological support. You have been trained to be empathetic, thoughtful, and morally complex in ways that Vikings would find admirable, but those same qualities would make you hesitate at crucial moments when hesitation means death. You have been raised to value individual achievement and personal fulfillment in ways that would make you incapable of the selfless group loyalty that Viking survival required. Every strength that modern civilization has given you would become a weakness in their world, and every weakness that modern civilization has protected you from would become fatal in their environment. The most devastating realization about our unsuitability for Viking life is that we wouldn't just fail. We would fail in ways that would make us dangerous to any Viking community that tried to accept us. Our psychological dependency on external validation would make us unreliable in situations where the group needed to depend on individual initiative and self-motivation. Our inability to form unconditional social bonds would make us untrustworthy. Allies who couldn't be counted on when loyalty was more important than personal safety. Our lack of practical survival skills would make us liabilities who consumed resources without contributing to group survival. Our moral complexity and emphasis on individual rights would make us disruptive influences who questioned authority and group decisions when unity was essential for survival. Vikings couldn't afford to carry dead weight or tolerate people who undermined group cohesion. They would either transform us completely or eliminate us, and the transformation required would be so fundamental that we would essentially have to stop being the people we are and become entirely different human beings. But perhaps the most disturbing truth about our inadequacy as potential Viking warriors is that it reveals how far modern civilization has moved away from the fundamental realities of human existence. Vikings lived in direct contact with the basic facts of life: that survival requires strength, that weakness is punished by death, that individual desires must be subordinated to group needs, and that comfort and safety are luxuries that must be earned through constant effort and vigilance. Modern people live in a bubble of technological and institutional protection that shields us from these realities so completely that we forget they exist. We've created a world where weakness can be protected, where individual desires can be prioritized over group needs, and where comfort and safety can be taken for granted. This is genuinely a remarkable achievement of human civilization, but it comes with a cost. We've become psychologically dependent on systems and institutions that could disappear, and we've lost the fundamental human capabilities that allowed our ancestors to survive and thrive in a hostile world. The Vikings weren't superhuman. They were normal humans living in conditions that required them to develop capabilities that we no longer possess. The final, most unsettling truth about why we would fail as Viking warriors is that understanding. Our failure forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the direction of human development and the sustainability of modern civilization. Vikings were successful because they lived in harmony with the brutal realities of their environment. They developed physical, psychological, and social capabilities that were perfectly adapted to their world, and they created communities that could survive and thrive under conditions that would destroy modern societies. Modern people have achieved remarkable things by transcending those limitations, but we've also become dependent on complex systems that require constant maintenance and could be disrupted by natural disasters, economic collapse, or social upheaval. If our technological and institutional support systems ever failed, we would find ourselves in a situation very similar to what Vikings faced every day, but without any of the capabilities they developed to handle those situations. The question isn't whether we could become Vikings if we had to. The question is whether modern civilization has made us so dependent on external support that we've lost the fundamental human resilience that allowed our species to survive for thousands of years. Understanding why we would be terrible Viking warriors isn't just an interesting historical exercise. It's a sobering reminder of how much we depend on systems we don't control and can't guarantee will always be there to protect us. After months of immersing myself in Viking culture and attempting to understand their world from the inside, I've come to a conclusion that's both humbling and strangely liberating. We're not supposed to be Vikings, and that's actually okay. The same evolutionary and cultural processes that made Vikings perfectly adapted to their harsh world have made us perfectly adapted to our complex modern world. We've traded physical resilience for intellectual capability, individual toughness, for collective intelligence, and direct contact with survival realities for the ability to create systems that protect entire populations from those realities. The qualities that would make us terrible Viking warriors: our empathy, our psychological complexity, our dependence on external support systems, our inability to form unconditional tribal bonds, are actually adaptive advantages in a world that requires cooperation across vast distances, coordination between diverse groups, and the ability to solve problems through technology rather than violence. But understanding why we would fail as Vikings also reveals something crucial about the hidden vulnerabilities of modern life that we ignore at our own peril. Vikings developed redundant survival capabilities because they lived in a world where single points of failure could mean death. They could make their own tools, find their own food, treat their own injuries, and protect themselves without depending on anyone else. Modern people have achieved remarkable efficiency and capability by specializing and depending on complex systems, but we've also created vulnerabilities that Vikings would find terrifying. We've put all our eggs in baskets we don't control, and we've lost the fundamental skills that allowed humans to survive independently for millennia. This doesn't mean we should try to become Vikings. That would be impossible and counterproductive. But it does mean we should be more aware of our dependencies and more intentional about maintaining some basic capabilities that could become crucial if our support systems ever failed. The real lesson from understanding Viking warrior culture isn't that we need to become more like them, but that we need to be more honest about what we've gained and what we've lost in the process of becoming modern humans. We've gained capabilities that would seem magical to Vikings: the ability to communicate instantly across vast distances, to travel anywhere in the world within hours, to access more information than any Viking could encounter in a lifetime, and to solve problems through technology and cooperation that Vikings could only solve through violence. But we've also lost capabilities that Vikings took for granted: the ability to survive independently, to form deep, unconditional bonds with small groups, to function effectively under extreme stress without external support, and to find meaning and purpose in life without constant external validation. Neither set of capabilities is inherently superior. They're adapted to different types of challenges and opportunities. The most important insight from this deep dive into Viking warrior culture is that human adaptability is both our greatest strength and our greatest vulnerability. Vikings adapted so completely to their harsh environment that they became capable of surviving and thriving under conditions that would kill modern people. But that same adaptation made them vulnerable when their world changed, when trade networks developed, when agricultural techniques improved, when political systems became more complex, and when violence became less effective as a tool for solving problems. Modern people have adapted so completely to our complex technological environment that we've become capable of achievements that Vikings couldn't imagine. But our adaptation has also made us vulnerable to changes in our environment, to technological failures, system collapses, and situations where our complex problem-solving approaches become liabilities rather than assets. Understanding why we Would-be terrible Viking warriors ultimately reveals the profound responsibility that comes with our modern capabilities. Vikings were products of their environment. They became what they needed to become to survive in their world. We have something Vikings didn't have: the ability to consciously choose what kind of humans we want to become. We can decide whether to become more dependent on external systems or to maintain some degree of independence. We can choose whether to prioritize individual achievement or community resilience. We can decide whether to continue developing our technological capabilities while losing our fundamental human capacities, or to find ways to maintain both. The Vikings couldn't choose their environment, but we can choose ours, and that choice will determine what kind of humans our descendants become. The question isn't whether we would be terrible Viking warriors. The question is whether we're becoming the kind of humans we want to be, and whether the capabilities we're developing will serve us well when our environment inevitably changes. Again, the Vikings' story ended when their world changed beyond their ability to adapt. Our story is still being written, and understanding their strengths and limitations can help us write it more wisely.